Hello and welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. This is one of your regular hosts, Matthew, with the other regular host, Andrew. Say hello to the world, Andrew.
Hello to the world.
Hello. And today, I can't tell you how excited I am about this episode. I'm almost childish about it. Anyway, today, Andrew and I are talking to Dr. Philip Goff. Philip is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Durham University here in the UK. So we have a UK guest, another brilliant one. So, hello, Philip, and welcome, and thank you so much for coming on with us.
Hello. Good. Thanks. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Right. So, Philip, I sent you a tentative email after hearing your appearance on the Unbelievable podcast with Justin Briley, and you were very enthusiastic about coming on and said straight away, yes, you want to come on, and we've exchanged quite a few emails coming on to this. So, first of all, thank you. And I know there's several of our listeners who have bugged me already to have you on. So I'm really anticipating this is going to be a look forward to episode. Did I say that right? Anyway, yes. So thank you. And
fantastic.
My introduction to asking you to come on was my wife and I listened to the episode of Unbelievable that you were on while we're on a car journey going away for family weekend. And my wife's a Christian. I am not. We don't often listen to the Unbelievable episodes together, but it just so happened by happenstance that yours was an episode that we listened to together. And so this is an opportunity for me to properly understand some of the things that you said and you intended, because I want to be sure that I understood you correctly. Now, I came away, I think it was partway through that episode. If I understood correctly, you said that you identified as a Christian. And so I remarked while we're driving along, I said, really? If he doesn't believe the facts, how can he identify as a Christian? And my wife said, no, I'm not really sure that's what he said. Did he really say that? And then later on, as the conversation progressed, my wife said, oh, maybe he does. I don't understand that. So we don't often unite over issues of Christianity and in response to guests, but we united there. So congratulations on bringing in some marital unity on that, even if the reasons weren't for exactly the same reasons. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say on that. Do you identify as Christian? And let's expand on what we mean, or rather what you mean by religious fictionalism, and see what leads.
Cool, great, yeah. I think that also through Christy May, who I was debating on the Unbelievable podcast. I think it was just the summing up part, and we were invited to sort of sum up. I think we were invited to say what we thought of the statement that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, but it was just supposed to be a summing up. But then I think I started off saying, as a Christian, and Christy May was like, what are you talking about? It sort of blew up at the end. Yeah, I guess because fundamentally I think of religious identity not as a matter of belief, but as a matter of practice. I mean, maybe it would help actually, before we get to Christianity, to start off with the religious beliefs I do have, because I do have certain religious beliefs, although of a quite minimal sort. And that, I mean, maybe that would help to get a kind of background, and then move into how I understand religion and build up to get to the why the hell would I call myself a Christian. So, I mean, I might be repeating some things I said in the Unbelievable podcast here, but so I'm definitely an atheist about the omni-God, the all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good creator of the universe. And that's simply because of the problem of evil. I think, the argument from the existence of evil and suffering to the non-existence of the omni-God is I think one of the most compelling philosophical arguments there is. So I'm an atheist about that God, but I do believe in something that's a little bit harder to characterize, but I would put it by saying I believe that there's a moral and a spiritual aspect to reality. And I think that moral and spiritual aspect to reality is as real and concrete as what we know about the world scientifically. So I call this the transcendent. Maybe it's similar to what William James called the more. But by transcendent, I don't mean to imply necessarily that it's something supernatural, just in the sense that it transcends what we know about the world scientifically. I mean, maybe we could talk a little bit more about that, but just to finally just make the link to religion, I suppose I think of the purpose of religion as about connecting up individuals and communities to the transcendent, allowing people to live in a way that acknowledges its existence and helps one to deepen one's awareness of the transcendent. So that's how I see the purpose of religion. I don't see it fundamentally as a matter of belief, but as a matter of practice, a practice that helps one orientate one's life towards the transcendent.
That is very interesting. We talked in the run up before we started recording about just sort of having a chat around these things, and so my first question is, if we could deduce through some set of scientific principles and eventual scientific discovery, and by the way, I don't recognize scientific evidence as being different from any other kind of evidence. So in that sense, you might view me as a strict materialist, right? So, but it's useful for you to know that that's sort of where this question comes from. So if we deduced through modeling and empirical evidence that our social drive, our need for social structure and human interaction, and the sort of ethics that do seem to transcend the individual, right? Because we see ethical behavior largely in every society we encounter, and that seems to be sort of a golden thread that runs through human history, right? How to treat each other is a big idea. If we discovered that was just a social characteristic passed down to us by nature of being social creatures in evolution, would you be as happy with that as a transcendent source as you would be if we discovered that there's actually some benevolent winder of the universe that imprinted that in our DNA?
Yeah, I guess I'm not fundamentally motivated by where we get our moral views from and our moral motivations, although perhaps the views I embrace about ethics may make that rather tricky to make sense of. But I mean, my motivation is not, where do we get moral principles from? It must have been from God rather than evolution. I mean, the point is just what grounds moral truths. I mean, I guess if your listeners are familiar with these Christian apologetic debates and William Lane Craig, I mean, he has arguments that there must be, if there are objective moral truths, there must be an objective ground to moral truths.
Right. An objective lawgiver. Yeah.
Well, I buy that kind of line to the extent that there must be some objective source of moral value, but I completely don't buy that it must be a person of some kind or even supernatural. In fact, I think divine command theories of ethics are just wildly implausible for all sorts of reasons. The use or throw dilemma being the obvious one. So I think there is an objective source of moral value. Basically, this was Plato's view, right? That there is, in some sense, the form of the good, there's goodness itself. Yeah. But I don't see any kind of philosophical reason to think it must be a person of some kind. So if there was just what we know about from empirical science about the world and about our development, and that was all that there was, then I think there would be no facts about value. The fact that the facts of natural science are valueless. But I think we encounter value. We encounter value in lived human experience, and I guess I don't see why I should be. I think it's rational to trust our experiences of value in the same way it's rational to trust our experiences, our sensory experience. I think all knowledge of anything outside of one's own mind begins with trusting certain experiences. I've experienced that suggests there's a table in front of me here, but I don't know for sure. I could be in the Matrix. It could be a very vivid dream. But I think it's rational to trust that experience and to believe there's a table in front of me. Similarly, I have moral experiences that, suggest to me that torturing children for fun is bad. And, maybe they're delusions, but I think it's rational to trust those experiences. And in doing so, I think you're committing to a reality that in some sense goes beyond what we know about scientifically. Although I wouldn't want to say it's necessarily supernatural. Does that make sense?
So you're not claiming,
so
you're not claiming dualism, just that there are our sense experience. So I think there's, we may end up over in a conversation about qualia pretty quickly. Although I'm not sure that that's necessarily the appeal that you're making, but there do seem to be certain types of questions and answers that empiricism doesn't get to the heart of.
Yeah, and here's a very uncontroversial case: mathematics. I think there's a fact about the world, 2 + 2 is 4. We don't know that from empirical science. We don't know that with our senses. We know it through intuition. So I think there's certainly more to the world than what we know about scientifically, because there's also mathematical facts. And like Plato, I think that's part of the nature of reality. It's part of the timeless nature of reality that 2 + 2 is 4. And that's something we know through intuition. And so I don't see why. So I guess I think of mathematical and moral truths as sort of in the same ballpark, again, as Plato did. So I think there's what we know about through our senses, about the spatio-temporal world, and there's also what we know through intuition, facts about logic and mathematics, facts about morality. But it's all of the same reality, I think. I think I would depart from Plato in that regard. Plato thought it was this other realm, but I don't see why we shouldn't just think there's just the universe, but it has this spatio-temporal nature, and it has this timeless mathematical moral nature as well.
I wonder. So I don't want to turn this into a conversation about the heart of mathematics, because every listener will switch off, right? And we'll just be talking to each other.
That's true.
But I
tended not to mention mathematics, actually. But
no, well, I do think that there's something philosophically interesting in that conversation, though. And so now probably every listener switched off anyway, because I just used the phrase philosophically interesting. But I do think that it's worth talking about, because when we say that we have an intuition about 2 + 2 = 4, I think that's true. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, that intuition is remarkably faulty. So I can say that I have an intuition that 1 + 1 = 2, or I might even grasp an intuition that 5 + 5 = 10. But I don't have any intuition about the answer 301 + 489 + 87 + 92. So at some point, I don't entirely buy the idea that our mathematical intuition is a thing that we have at sort of bare metal, right? That this is a brute force fact about the universe. Because if it were, it seems to me that our intuition about large numbers should be equally as good as our intuition about small numbers. I know that there are the occasional savants who will simply say, but mine is, right? so I'll just say that I don't have that sort of unique brain, right? I actually have to press the buttons or operate the mechanics of math if I'm not using a calculator to come up with the right answer. And so I think for me, the idea of mathematical intuition doesn't get me to the same place that it does you, because there are more outliers for answers to mathematical problems than there are places where I actually have intuition that's not faulty.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I suppose I would say I don't see why it follows from what you said, which was of course true, that we don't have intuitions about very complicated sums. I don't see why it follows that we don't know mathematics through intuition. I mean, similarly with sense experience, I can see some things. I can see the table in front of me, but I can't see without the help of a telescope distant galaxies, and even with the help of a telescope we can't see things outside of our light cone. So I don't see why it shouldn't be the same with mathematical intuition. And I mean, it's hard to see how else we learn about mathematics. There are pure mathematicians in our universities who sit there and work out all kind of cool things about the mathematical realm, and most of them take themselves to be discovering these things. They're not sitting there making them up. They're not novelists. They discover really cool truths about the mathematical realm. And how are they doing? They're not doing experiments. They're not. At least on the face of it, they're learning about reality through intuition. And I think that's what we do with morality as well. Sorry.
Oh, that's very interesting. So it's going to stay over in mathematics for another second. I promise. I promise to leave.
Maths.
It's the teaser for what's about to come. That's what it is.
Yeah. So I think I see I think we're in accord in part of this and not in another part. So I am not at all suggesting that the work of abstract thought doesn't lead us to incredibly important truths. Abstract thought, I think, is our most powerful human tool. It's probably what separates us from what we call lower order primates or whatever, right? And so we get imaginary numbers through that exercise, and we couldn't have this conversation that we're having, in multiple parts of the world without some of those important mathematical realizations. So I agree with all of that. However, the idea of discovery, it's not as if the theoretical mathematician, the person who is actually exploring the boundaries of the vistas of maths, it is not as if every idea they have is a good idea. And those ideas that we ultimately find beneficial are exercised against the physical world. So in the case of imaginary numbers, just as for instance, right? It is the case that when we learn about imaginary numbers, not every intuition that we have about imaginary things is in some sense real. And by real in this case, I guess I just mean useful, right? That it tells us something about the physical world. And so in that sense, I think our intuition actually probably comes from a primitive understanding about identity and non-contradiction and laws of exclusion and that sort of thing. Things that I think we learn probably through our senses without quite being able to name them.
That's very interesting. Okay, two things in response to that. What was I got lost on the second point then. What was the first point again?
Oh, sure, no problem. Okay, so as I remember it, not particularly, I have a really small memory buffer. It's remarkable. You'd swear I was using a Windows product.
Oh no, I remembered what you said. Let me come back.
Please.
Yeah, so I agree, right? Some maths is more useful in understanding physical reality. We used to think Euclidean geometry corresponded to physical reality. Now we think non-Euclidean geometries do. So that's one application of maths. But a lot of maths, that's why I focus on pure maths, is just finding out about the mathematical realm, regardless of whether it corresponds to physical reality. I mean, I just. Let me give you a bit of big narrative here, and then I'll come back to your point about your very interesting thought about how we learn these things, maybe subtly through our senses. I think we are going through a phase of history where people are so blown away by rightfully by the success of physical science, and the wonderful technology it's produced, that we're inclined to think, oh, that's it, that must be everything, and that's nice because that gives you a kind of nice sense of security, uncertainty. You trust science, that's what the world is like. But I think this actually begins maybe with David Hume reducing the casting doubt on the substantial nature of mathematical and a priori truths. He just thinks, oh, they're just relations between ideas, they're just. But I think there's all sorts of things that don't fit into that picture. I mean, consciousness is one thing I spend a lot of time dealing with, but also mathematical truths, logical truths. So, I think we've got a very strange picture of the world where actually our official picture of the world can't accommodate many other things that we all know to be real. Nobody denies that there are mathematical truths. Most people don't deny there are moral truths. Hardly anyone denies there's consciousness, and yet I think these things don't fit into this worldview that's essentially been brought about because of just being blown away by the success of physical science. Anyway, that was a bit of rhetoric that you could maybe edit it out. It was a bit rambling, but you had
no. I actually,
it was lovely. Yeah, that won't get cut.
No, I see something important in what you're saying there, because in one sense you're questioning whether I'm being a skeptic or whether I'm being a cynic, and I don't want to be cynical about the possibility of new truth, right? So I am an empiricist. I'm pretty convinced of that, right? But I don't want to be closed to the notion that there are potential ideas that are just as useful or beneficial, right? And so I do want to be careful about not letting my skepticism become cynicism.
Yeah, no, sure, that's appreciated. I didn't mean to suggest that, but you had this interesting idea towards the end that maybe we sort of subtly learn about the non-contradiction through our senses and so on. I suppose I'm inclined to think that there could be a race of creatures that evolved to know mathematical truths and logical truths as though they were contingent laws of nature. So they might think, oh, 2 + 2 happens to be 4, but it could have been different. There are no contradictions, there are no square circles, but there could have been. And presumably those creatures would survive just as well. But I think not only do we know that 2 + 2 is 4, but we know that has to be true. We can just, as it were, see intuitively that square circles are impossible, that contradictions are impossible. I mean, I really buy what Descartes talks of clear and distinct perception. So I guess I'm an old school rationalist in that sense, thinking that there are things that are just apparent to us with something close to certainty that involve mathematical and logical truths. And I find it hard to make sense of, how we could know about those with our senses. I mean, some philosophers have tried to make sense of that. John Stuart Mill tried to make sense of mathematics being empirical, but it's tough to see how it can be done. But why are we trying to do this? I mean, why on earth would we try and think that we know about mathematical truths through our senses? I think it's because we feel, that we're in this mindset that natural science is so amazing. Wouldn't it be wonderful if that was the whole story? I argue in my new book, Galileo's Error, in fact, I think, the reason natural science has been so successful, here's the irony, is because it focused on a very narrow focused domain of inquiry, namely, tracking the behavior of matter, seeing what mathematical models you could get to predict the behavior of matter. That's gone really well for the last 500 years. But, it's gone really well precisely because from the start, we set on side things like consciousness, mathematical truths, logical truths, that's outside of the domain. But I think we've forgotten that the whole thing was premised on ignoring these things that, are not really anything to do with what empirical science is in the business of. Anyway, but it's a big debate.
Yeah. Matthew, I know that you tried to say something a moment ago, and I don't want to.
Yeah, there were a couple of thoughts. I'm not convinced that the 2 + 2 + 4 example is the best one to illustrate, because if you've got a beautiful home baked rhubarb crumble in front of you and you want to divide that equally between 4 people to consume, there's only one way pretty much in which you can divide that into 4 equal pieces, and it doesn't matter whether you understand the concept of 2 + 2 = 4 or not. The physics of how you cut that crumble isn't going to change. But I think where intuition does get thrown is an example that I like is if you draw a triangle on a perfect sphere, you can draw a triangle with 3 right angles, but mathematics tells us that can't happen, and maybe that's the area that you need to move to show the complexity and how you rationalize these kinds of things.
Yeah, it's a very interesting example. Well, so certainly our mathematical intuition is not certain, is fallible, like sense experience is fallible, and we've discovered we were wrong about certain things. We thought geometry has to be Euclidean, and we now know, of course, that there are non-Euclidean geometries. So it's not infallible, but just because it's not infallible doesn't mean it's not a very good source of information.
So what does it mean? Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
Well, just to finish up, I guess what I think I think of the laws of mathematics as kind of like the laws of nature. Let's say the law of gravity constrains what can happen in our world, but only contingently, right? The law of gravity could have been different. But the laws of mathematics constrain that if you've got two things and you've got two things, you've got four things, or that there can't be square circles. I think that is a substantive fact about reality, that there can't be square circles. But it's not the laws of physics that determines that, it's the laws of mathematics. So maybe that conveys a little bit more the sense in which I think this is just a real concrete part of our universe. And that's what's so messed up about our current worldview, that it's not in our current worldview. It's something we all accept, but it doesn't have a place in our current worldview. Yeah, that's.
So you said our intuition can be wrong.
Yeah.
But in some sense, we have an intuition. And by the way, I agree that I seem to have this intuition that there can't be square circles, or that 2 + 2 has a very specific answer, and that answer is 4. I share that. I share that sense of intuition with you. I share Matthew's sense of intuition that we've got a rhubarb crumble, and by the way, if you've got one and I don't, send it. But so if we want a certain number of, so if we want equal size pieces, right? There's only a few ways to get that. Only one way to get that done, right? But if we're saying that our intuition about these things, there can't be square circles, then we're making a case that, we have this 100% intuition that can somehow be wrong about very similar kinds of things, because it is possible for our mathematical intuition to be wrong.
Sure.
Now, I don't know that that's a great response to you. It's just the thing that is troubling me, if you see what I mean.
But that's a good segue though to fictionalism, though, isn't it? If our intuition is wrong, but that intuition suits us practically in everyday life, what's the problem?
Well, so moving on to fictionalism, I guess I don't think, I wouldn't want to say people should believe false things, which is maybe what you're implying there. I wouldn't want to say, if it's making you happy, I think you should try and avoid false beliefs. And the fictionalist, it does avoid false beliefs, because they take the beliefs, the core beliefs of the religion they're involved in, to be false, and they take them to be a fiction. So this is no more deceit or self-deceit than when you go and watch a movie and you get involved in it, and a lot of fictionalists have made analogies to that, actually. Going to a movie, you get involved in it, you might really gain all kinds of things from relating to the characters, but you don't believe it's true. And many fictionalists feel the same way about their chosen religion. But just to come back to, if I may, so how I relate all this stuff to Christianity. So as I say, I think of religion as a practice, right? A practice, a way of relating to the transcendent, this moral and spiritual and mathematical aspect of reality. I think mathematics is in there.
You're going to drag us back off over there, aren't you?
Let's leave mathematics. So in the specific case of Christianity, I take it to be practice whereby one relates to the transcendent through the character of Christ and through the story of the gospel. So through this story in which God is identified with a naked, executed peasant, a person who shuns the wealthy and powerful and eats with lepers and outcasts. So I think that's a powerful way of relating to the transcendent and a powerful way of anchoring one's spiritual life. So that's really the core of it for me. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I want to say something just kind of as preamble to my part of this conversation. I'll take a second. When you were on Unbelievable, and we haven't talked much about that show, that appearance on Unbelievable. I don't know if we'll talk a lot about it as we move on, but I had not come across the philosophical richness that is the tradition of fictionalism, not just in regard to religion, right? There's a lot of talk about fictionalism in philosophy with its application to other domains, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And so when I was reading the SEP entry, sorry, some people won't know what that is. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, plato.stanford.edu for the listeners that might want to look it up. So in preparation for our talk here, I went to read more about religious fictionalism, and the SEP entry came up. And there's fictionalism, it has a rich tradition outside just religious fictionalism in philosophy, and I had not come across it in the past, probably not surprisingly because I'm not a professional philosopher, right? But I was inclined when I heard your Unbelievable episode to give less weight to the importance of this idea of religious fictionalism maybe than I should have been, because when I started researching for this episode, it turns out that fictionalism has deep roots in philosophy that I had no idea about. Mm-hmm. And the SEP entry really cast the idea of religious fictionalism in a new light for me.
Okay.
So I can see the benefit of the idea of using religion to sort of create a framework to inculcate values into our society.
Yeah.
Even if the stories themselves don't hold hands with history, right?
Yeah.
They're not, in some sense, historically valid. So I was not inclined to give that idea a lot of value until I started realizing that we actually use fictionalism a lot in our everyday speech, which was, I think, pointed out in the SEP entry. I might say, let's pull out all the stops in regard to this podcast. And, now some people might say that's an idiom rather than, some sort of metaphor. But I do think that there's an importance to metaphor that I didn't see in your work prior to sort of doing a little deeper dive.
Right, that's very interesting. And I suppose, although I don't think the core beliefs of Christianity are literally true, I do think there are deep truths that are put across through these narratives. So maybe I can say a little bit more about how I think about the climax of the Christian story in the crucifixion and the resurrection, to sort of spell out what. I mean, I guess your emails to Matthew was to make me think, why the hell are you a Christian rather than something else. So maybe if I talk
question, that's true.
I hope I didn't come across quite.
No, not at all. No. I'm exaggerating.
But there were people who pretty much phrased it like that on Facebook and on the Unbelievable forums.
So maybe I could just talk a little bit about, what the crucifixion and the resurrection signify for me. So, I think that there are two crucial features for me of the crucifixion. So firstly, there's the fact that God is not on the side in this story. God is not on the side of the powerful Roman Empire. God is on the side of the powerless, humiliated, executed peasant, right? It's that kind of inversion of worldly values. So, what does that signify in our own times? I think it signifies God is not on the side of, the powerful elites that run our world, is not on the side of the tax dodging multinationals and the corrupt dictators. God is on the side of, the immigrants in cages, right? God is on the side of the victims of human trafficking. So that's an important aspect of it. But the other important thing I think of the crucifixion is the apparent inevitability that the bad guys win. So I think for the women watching Jesus hang on the cross, it must have been like, the Roman Empire wins again. We thought maybe it'd be a bit different this time, but the Roman Empire always wins. Nothing ever changes. And I feel like many of us in the contemporary world think, oh, the 1% win again. 2008 global crash. Maybe things will change, but then ordinary people pay the price, and things never change. So that's really what a large part of the Good Friday story to me. But then moving to the resurrection, for me, what that signifies is the hope against all odds that God's preferences will prevail, that the corrupt forces that run our world won't have the last word. So I think that's a very powerful narrative. I think it's a narrative that inspired the peasant revolt of the 14th century, that inspired liberation theology in Central America, inspired the civil rights movement in the 60s. And, I think that's a narrative I don't want us to lose. But I mean, I don't take it to be literally true. You just heard me talk about the preferences of God, talking about as though God were a kind of person. I don't literally believe the transcendent is a kind of person. I'm sort of personifying. But I think engaging with that story does give us a deep and true understanding of the nature of the transcendent. So there are deep truths there, even though they're not the surface literal truths. Anyway, so that was very long-winded, but I just thought I'd try and think about how to convey. And I think I didn't get into this really in the Unbelievable podcast, and I kind of regretted that afterwards, just what it is that appeals to me about Christianity. And I think it is that inversion of worldly values, that identifying God with the humiliated, naked peasant. I mean, as St. Paul says in the start of 1 Corinthians, Christ crucified is folly of the world, something like folly of the world, but the wisdom of God. And I think, that's that kind of real value and real truth in that narrative. I don't really care if it's literally true. I don't see how it affects my spiritual life, whether such and such miracle happened 2,000 years ago. But still, that narrative has power, I think.
Yeah, that was good. That deserves a silence after it, I think. Yeah, and so there's a motivating element on there. Look after the needy among you, which certainly is an attitude of Jesus when you read the New Testament. Yeah, I identify with that. So was there a comment you wanted to make, Andrew? Because I wanted to jump on a question.
Maybe one question, because the listeners will know that it's hard for me not to ever follow if you give me the chance. So I think the obvious question that the skeptical listeners will have, because the Christian listeners are all saying what they should rightfully be saying, that even if you don't believe, you can find value in the story, right? So I'm happy with that. But would you be just as happy, out of curiosity, as a philosopher, I'm sure you've studied at some point some sort of comparative religion, at least occasionally, it comes up in the reading now and then. And so would you be just as happy for those people who are non-Christian but can find similar values in their own religious traditions? Are you just as happy for them to be, I'm going to go all the way off of the edge here, and I'm probably going to get some splashback, but for nonviolent Muslims, people in Islam that practice the Muslim traditions exactly the way nonviolent Christians practice theirs. So you just as happy for them to find the same values in their own religions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I kind of think, I suspect from what I've heard in interviews, Reza Aslan, I think he went from being an evangelical Christian to returning to his Muslim roots, and I think he has pretty much that approach to Islam. And yeah, I mean that's absolutely fine. Obviously, if what I'm talking about is ways of relating to the transcendent rather than prizing certain specific beliefs, then yeah, I'm very much open to different ways of. I think a lot of Jewish people I know have the same approach as me, in the sense of going to synagogue, involving themselves in the traditions without necessarily taking everything literally. And I suppose that's just I'm taking that same approach to Christianity. I mean, let me say actually a comparison to another religion, Buddhism. So I've had a lot of back and forth with Buddhism in my time, and I meditate every day, and I've got a hell of a lot of respect for Buddhism. But one reason I guess I didn't become a Buddhist is because at least in my experience of Buddhism in the West, it's almost wholly focused on personal, individual, spiritual development. And there's not much about power structures. There's not much about social injustice. There's not much about society. I mean, there are elements. I'm not saying that people are going to email me saying that's nonsense, but the core focus of the religion is individual self-improvement. Whereas what I love about Christianity is the focus on community. The central act of practice, the Eucharist, is symbolic eating and drinking together. The Lord's Prayer is said in the in the first person plural. Our Father. So, and it's always very much had a focus on poverty, identifying with the poor, identifying with outcasts, social engagement. So, sometimes actually, if I maybe I'd like a pick and mix religion where you have the sort of, the Buddhist focus on meditation and stuff about the absence of self, and maybe the Christian focus on community and poverty and loving your enemies and so on. But that's one reason, I guess, why I decided to go the Christian route rather than the Buddhist route. And it's not because I think Christianity is true and Buddhism is false. It's just because I think there's things in there I value that I couldn't get out of the Buddhism that I encountered in the West.
I like that answer, and
just
one
more thing about Buddhism. Just one more thing about Buddhism. Again, you might think, there's a lot of Western Buddhists who get a lot out of the practice but don't believe in rebirth. I mean, you might think what I'm doing is a little bit analogous to that, getting a lot out of the practice without necessarily believing in a literal resurrection. Sorry for interrupting you. Carry on.
No, that's good. I like the point you made about the difference in focus between improving of the self and actually making some efforts to improve the lives of those around us. And I think there's a beauty in that kind of attitude. And I want, what's the word? I don't know what word I'm looking for, but I just wanted to draw attention to that. And I think that's a glorious attitude for anyone to take, regardless of what your feelings of religion are. But what I'm hearing is, in my mind, is a lot of consternation from Christian literalists, and that is the kind of Christian that I was. So I said in the intro that you're from Durham, and we can't mention Durham without mentioning David Jenkins, who I assume that you're familiar with, who was bishop in Durham in the mid 80s to the mid 90s.
Yeah.
So to kind of set the scene a bit, I grew up in a missionary environment in Africa. So I arrived in the UK when I left home as an 18-year-old in 1988. So the UK culture was a new culture to me because I'd not lived in the UK apart from boarding school. So I found a church, and then in 1989, David Jenkins hit the headlines with his comments about the resurrection not being a physical resurrection, but it was a metaphysical resurrection, and Jesus lived inside us, of our followers, and our attitudes towards helping others was us living out the resurrection of Jesus, which sounds a little bit about what you're saying, but it sounds more mystical. But that was devastating to me as a 19-year-old. It just went against everything that I'd been taught growing up. And the church minister of the church that I went to was a Methodist church. He endorsed this view, and I remember sitting in this room when he was endorsing this view and trying to be reassuring to all of us. But looking back at the room, there were several people who were utterly devastated by this as a revelation, because they, like me, believed these things to be literally true. So yeah, devastating is really the only way to describe it. So what would you want to say to people listening who are having a similar reaction, to encourage them that actually you're not killing their world?
Sometimes it's very difficult, isn't it? People having very different approaches, and I sometimes think maybe fictionalism is the wrong word because it implies that the views are false. I guess for me, it's more maybe a better word might be religious pragmatist. That for me, the practice is important, whether or not the beliefs are true. So perhaps me and a more traditional believer can be unite around the things we do agree on. I mean, there's a lot of, as I said on the Unbelievable podcast, I really, a lot of what N.T. Wright says, although he's a much more conservative believer than me, a lot of what he says really resonates with me about, the focus of Orthodox Christianity on the physical world and on, it's not about floating off to a heavenly realm. It's about sort of bringing heaven and earth together, building the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven, as it were. But of course, I mean, there are deep disagreements, and I suppose it's a question of respect and maybe which church you go to. I recently went to a very evangelical church just to try it out, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't get anything out of it. I could, because it seemed so focused around the importance of belief and literally believing, and I just couldn't get anything out of it. Whereas the churches I've generally gone to all my life, there's an openness and people are happy with different interpretations of what's going on, and the gospel might draw out some wisdom or from the gospel. Sorry, the sermon might draw out some wisdom from the readings and relate that to everyday life, and it's compatible with various different ways of understanding what's going on. So I suppose I just hope this is what I'm advocating is something that's a neglected way of thinking about Christianity, and I just want to open up to people the possibility that might be something they could get a lot out of. But I'd understand if in a very evangelical church, if they they have their ways of doing things, it's very important for them to emphasize belief. Maybe they wouldn't want me coming in and running in their Sunday school and teaching the kids about Christian fictionalism or something. That's fair enough. So I guess it's about
podcast though. We want that.
But then
I mean, what I love about the Church of England is it's so broad, perhaps because of the unique circumstances of its origins, with the king wanting a divorce, and so it's so broad. We have the very conservative churches. You've got the high church is more Catholic than Catholic. You've got very liberal churches I used to go to where they just made up the liturgy every week and it was more orthodox. My approach was kind of the orthodoxy. So, I love that broad church, and I think maybe people don't realize it is as broad as it is. So I guess it's about respect, and I'm just opening up this alternative. But sorry, I interrupted you again.
No, but I was just saying, just to mirror what you said about going to church. Now, I wouldn't want my child to go into a church Sunday school and be taught that evolution is a lie and the world is 6,000 years old. That would devastate me and fill me with rage. So sometimes the attitude is more important than arguing over the facts.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. We can have in common what we have in common, but respectfully allow people to do their own thing and run their churches how they want to, as long as liberal Christians like me are allowed to run churches how we want to, or at least be open to have people involved who have a more liberal, less literal approach.
That's one of the big frustrations for me. I was the listeners, I think, have heard, I was a very conservative Christian at some point in the past. In fact, I belonged to what, by any reckoning, was a cult. So one of the things that frustrates me as an atheist now is there are still Christian values that I very much promote. I wouldn't lie to you any more than you would lie to me, even the most conservative Christian. So by you here, I mean the editorial you, if you will. So I wouldn't lie to you. I wouldn't cheat you in a business deal. I wouldn't mistreat your children or have your wife cheat on me in some sort of extramarital way. And by and large, I think that's true for as many atheists as it is for Christians, right? I'm not claiming that I'm perfect. I'm certainly not, but I'm not less perfect than the people that are, deep Christians. And so if there's one thing that I wish everyone could take away, it is that by and large, we are all much more similar than we are different, even if we don't reach the conclusions the same way.
Yeah. Amen to that.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't want to say, I'm not saying, why do I want to keep Christianity going? It's not because I think everyone's going to become really evil if we forget about it. It's just, it's two things really. I mean, one, what I've already talked about. I am religious in the sense that I do believe in this transcendent spiritual reality, and I think it's important to have institutions that connect people up to that. So that's part of what it's about. So it's not about telling people what they ought to do, but about facilitating spiritual practice. But secondly, also, I think just bringing people together is important. That it's hard. There's very powerful forces in contemporary society, consumerism and global capitalism, and it's very powerful forces that it's hard to counter just as an individual being a good person, and it's hard to make much of an impact. Something I found out recently, someone told me. So Rosa Parks, who's started the civil rights movement by refusing to stand up on a bus for a white person.
I grew up not far from that town, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I've always thought of it, and I don't know about you guys, it was just a lone individual who just, had enough and, couldn't take it anymore. But in fact, I was told by my sister actually when she did a community organizing course, it was part of a planned protest. It was part of a civil rights action involving Martin Luther King. It was a completely planned thing. And I think you rarely get change until you bring people together and you organize. Nothing happens. There's such powerful forces in society, in the world we live in, that nothing happened unless you organize. So I think that's part of the value of religion to me. Getting people together in the community on a regular basis of all socioeconomic backgrounds. You're not getting together because of what you can get out of each other. You're just getting together to be there as a community, have a cup of tea afterwards. And then, naturally when you do that, you start to think, what can we do in this community? And the church in the UK is running, most of the food banks. My church has a eco festival every year that's brought together a lot of environmental groups in the area actually that hadn't hooked up before. And I think that's just, getting people together and working out how you can make a difference. And I don't deny actually, there may be non-religious ways of doing this. I reviewed a very good book by Philip called Life After Faith, where he was raised religiously and rejected as an atheist, but he sees the value in religious institutions, and he tries to encourage us in this book to set up secular alternatives that can play the role in the community that religion once played. So that's one way forward, although it doesn't seem to have sort of caught on for the moment. But
I want to loudly echo that though, because I think one of the things that I almost hate to acknowledge this out loud, and I find that I have to almost every episode. One of the failures of sort of the skeptical movement, I think Sam Harris is pretty open about this, among other atheist thinkers, is that we have not managed to build the sort of community that religion has built. I think there are real reasons for that. I think in the United States, one of the least trusted, in fact, the least trusted social class in the United States, according to Pew Research, is atheists. We actually fall behind we actually fall behind criminals that former felons, right?
God.
Now, right. So now, look, I don't. I think there's a whole social injustice there, and we don't have time to talk about the social injustice of institutionalized prison systems, and how prison systems have gone corporate. No, you can't do that. But it's funny to find myself as an atheist, someone who I broadly agree with Christian values. It's funny to find myself as one of the least trusted people in the United States, right? But and I think that is actually part of the reason that we have failed to build social structure, because like the LGBTQ community, we are still fighting for an open place in society. Mm-hmm. And it is incredibly difficult to build large socially valuable communities when you're still fighting to just be recognized as a decent human being. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's my 2 cents for what it's worth.
I guess that's very interesting. Although that I guess that wouldn't apply in the UK as much. I don't think that would explain why secular institutions haven't arisen in a European context. Yes, I mean Sam Harris. Yeah, I like Sam Harris's work, saying that focusing on the importance of spirituality and spiritual practice for secular atheists, but perhaps what he's focused less on is the community institutions. I think I personally think there's a real role to play there, whether you do it in a secular way or you do it in a religious way. But I think there is something.
We miss that. We've talked about it a number of times in the past on other shows, that one of the things that we as former Christians miss is that sense of community that you're talking about.
Yeah. Can I just go back and say? Oh, sorry. No, go on.
I think one of the benefits of religious practice is it provides a motivation and a focus for people to gather together, and then they're there, and then you've got this focus for your community thing, and I think it's that separate commonality of belief and worship that gets people there. So there's a focus, there's a drive, there's a motivation, and then out of that springs the community work and the community fellowship, because it doesn't always work to say let's all get together and do something good for community. You need something, dare I say it, bigger to bring people together. I live in a coastal town on the west coast of the UK, and every couple of months there's a community beach clean, and you see the photos on the local news Facebook page. But when you see the numbers of people turning up for that, it's fewer than the number of people who are going to church every Sunday morning.
No, I think you're right there. Actually, that must be part of the explanation. It's hard to just inspire people to just get together, isn't it? And I think that it's a shame, because I feel like what you have in a religious context is it's perhaps the only time you meet up with people, and it's not because what you can get out of them. And I don't mean that in a cynical way, right? We meet people because we like them, or we have a common interest. We like spending time together, and that's obviously fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But still, it's because of what you can get out of the situation. Whereas, in a religious context, you're just there just because people live nearby. I mean, that's why you're getting together. It's not because of. But I see what you're saying about. It's a good point that maybe hadn't fully occurred to me, Matthew. That it's how do you get people to do it? You maybe need something else to get to get them.
But then there's a bigger question, is that it does become an exclusive club, because now that I no longer subscribe to any of the core beliefs of Christianity, I no longer attend church, so I don't go to church. So the people there that I know, I see them extraordinarily rarely, because I don't identify with what it is that they're doing corporately in a church building. And Andrew and I get occasionally contacted through the podcast that we do, more specifically Ask an Atheist Anything than this podcast, but we do, because there's a book which is a critique of the core beliefs of Christianity that's connected to this podcast, also called Still Unbelievable. And we've been contacted occasionally by a few people who are exiting from the core beliefs of Christianity, and they find themselves in the inverse situation, and they're losing a community because they can no longer subscribe to that. And I think for people like myself and people like those who are exiting the core beliefs of Christianity, but you still attend church. I haven't asked you how regularly. You feel free to answer that shortly. But you do still go, and I'm assuming that there's some form of community that you appreciate from attending church as a fictionalist. Where do maybe churches need to think more broadly and more liberally about people like me and people like those who are exiting, and maybe there is a benefit to the church of embracing fictionalism rather than rejecting fictionalism, because there is more that they can offer to the community.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, so firstly, I suppose I do attend church, I guess, a couple of times a month. I mean, so I used to attend an incredibly liberal church. I found my perfect church when I was living in Liverpool. Whereas, as I said, my fictionist approach was kind of more the orthodoxy. This was St. Bride's. I should maybe give them a plug. And they used to wear kind of rainbow dog collars for when it was awesome. Pride and stuff. And
that's fantastic.
And sorry,
I think that's fantastic. It's brilliant. I think that's really cool.
And they used to sort of make up the liturgy, and actually the priest didn't often say the sermon. It was said by someone different from the congregation each week. And then they had themes. For example, one of the themes was living with suffering, where someone who was living with a particular suffering each week did the sermon. And so someone with HIV, someone with early dementia, someone with autism, and it's absolutely the most moving thing I've ever come across. But I guess in general, the church I go to are just sort of run-of-the-mill Anglican churches that, in my experience, are quite open, and there tends to be a fair number of people there when I speak to. If you rarely get into the discussion of belief, but I tend to meet quite a lot of people who have roughly the same view of not taking things literally, or another approach that's slightly more moderate is taking things literally, but having not going so far as to say you believe, but maybe you perhaps hope it's true, or you sort of engage with the possibility of its truth. So there's this approach, sometimes called non-doxastic approaches to religion. I've got a blog post called Religion But Not As We Know It, where I distinguish, in case it's of interest to anyone, these different possibilities. So fictionalism would be the more extreme approach, where you actually think it's false. But then the non-doxastic approach would be, well, I think it might be true. I don't have enough evidence to fully believe, but I sort of live in hopeful commitment that it's true. This is the approach of, for example, William Alston or Howard Schneider. That's a double-barreled surname. I can't remember his first name. But one of the things William Alston talks about is that they're both US philosophers, about, college, when you do have this intense pressure in some American religious communities to believe, and then kids go to college and they feel, I don't really feel like I believe in that strong sense, and they feel they have to leave. And as you say, that can lead to terrible turmoil about losing your community and so on. So yeah, I certainly think religious communities ideally would be open to fictionalist approaches, but if not that, at least be educating people that they can have this approach that's not disbelieving, but is saying, it's sort of agnosticism, I guess, saying I don't know if it's true, but I'm choosing to live in hopeful commitment that it's true. And surely that's not offensive. I don't see how one could find that kind of position problematic or offensive? So if the church could educate people, look, that's a way of doing it, that's an option, then I think they'd lose a lot less people. Whereas I think the way people think about religion, it is, or do I believe this is true? Like religion is a sort of a theory of reality, and when you decide to sign up to religion, you think, do I hold that theory of reality? Whereas I think it's largely about, it's a culture and spiritual practice and community and tradition. So it's not going to solve all the problems you're alluding to, because there are different religions, and people won't want to be part of a religious community, and that's fine. But I certainly think there's a lot more one can do to open oneself up to a diversity of, when you think about it, it is weird defining cultural identity and community inclusion on belief, because belief is for one thing involuntary. You can't choose what to believe. It's an involuntary response to what you think is the evidence. And so it's very cruel to exclude someone from a community because of what they can't help. And I mean, I'm partly persuaded by people like Karen Armstrong that it's actually, this focus on belief is a sort of modern corruption, although I'm not a historian, I'm not certain about. But yeah, I certainly think it's problematic. Sorry, that was a bit long.
No. Look, two things. First, I kept hearing Pascal's wager a second ago. It's one of the things that Christians will say quite a lot is, okay, fine, you don't believe in Christianity, but surely it's good to live as a Christian because there are good values there. And Pascal's wager almost always comes up, right? Why not live that way, even if you don't believe? And so I don't understand for those who are inclined to be agnostic but practice Christianity. Christianity often backs itself with Pascal's wager, so I don't understand the objection there. But yeah, I read your blog post, and one of the things that I found fascinating, Greek for me, by the way, was 31 years ago. Okay, so semester of Greek was a long time ago. But one of the things I found interesting in your blog post was a discussion of the word faith, right? And that faith at some point so when we think about first century Greek, right, faith was not a verb, right? Yeah. And so it was.
Faith was a verb, I think. Faith was a verb.
Right.
But,
sorry.
But in English, it's not a verb. Yeah.
Right.
I get confused by that as well.
Yeah. No, my apologies, and that's absolutely right. I wonder if you would take a second, because faith is what you were talking about there. It's very central to the Christian religion, how we see faith. Right. You've got to believe these core tenets, right? And if you don't, somehow you're broken, right? Your God detector's messed up, and there's some sort of fellowship issue that follows on from that. And so I thought that one of the really interesting things there was that the way we use faith now is very different from the way the word faith is planted in Greek texts, whether you argue that they're first century or not, wherever you think the books fell on the timeline doesn't actually matter. And I wonder if you'd talk about that for a second, if you can. I'm sort of asking you to speak extemporaneously on something pretty complex, but if you would, I think it's probably useful to listeners.
Sure. Yeah. So the thought is that the Greek word that we translate as faith, pistis, doesn't actually mean belief in the modern sense. It rather has connotations of commitment or engagement. And we often translated it, as you say, as believe, right? Because in Greek, you can say to faith, I faith, you faith, he, she, it faiths. You can't say that in English, although I just did, paradoxically. So it was often translated as believe. But now in the 16th, 17th century, when the Bible was first translated, that wasn't a bad translation, because the word belief had a different meaning then. It had connotations of to prize or to hold dear. So Karen Armstrong, for example, quotes, which Shakespeare play is it? I can't recall offhand now, but the character being told to believe not thy disdain. So don't have your
to
heart
cherish.
in your disdain. Yeah, don't cherish your disdain. The character is Bertram, I think, is feeling disdain for the low-born Helena, and he's told, believe her. So the word was much closer to this idea of, in Chaucer we find, I can't remember the Chaucer references offhand, forget it, but it was much closer to the German belieben, to love, this idea of committing. And so actually Karen Armstrong thinks, and this is how I like to think about it actually, we should actually think of the creed as not I believe, but I commit. I put my heart into this. So when the Bible was first translated, belief was not a bad translation for pistis, the Greek word for faith. But then, as the scientific revolution progresses, belief comes slowly to be associated with, cold-blooded intellectual assent to a proposition about reality, and ends up having the word belief as we have it today. And so now, when you read the Gospels, you think, oh, Jesus really cared, what your theory of reality was, and what propositions you sign up to, and salvation depends on, whether you have the correct theory of reality, which is kind of bizarre. Whereas, it's not at all clear that was exactly a correct translation. So, who I mentioned before, Howard Schneider. That's his son. It's a double-barreled surname. Howard Schneider has a very interesting paper, Mark and Faith, which is textual analysis of Mark's gospel. And he makes quite a compelling case that actually when Jesus talks about faith, what he's meaning is a kind of resilient commitment, a kind of a resilient religious commitment in the face of adversity. Because all of the people he praises, it's in these contexts. It's not about what theory of reality they have. It's in these contexts where people have really stuck out and really gone to the what's the expression, gone to the nth mile, gone to the nth degree.
Yeah,
anyway
yeah.
So I think it's arguable that this is something of a modern corruption, this defining religious identity in terms of belief. Yeah, that would be the argument.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It was one of those things when I was I was doing preparation for this episode. I don't think in the 5 years of theological training I went through, I was double majoring, so I wasn't, I managed to cram 4 years into 5. But when, in all of those religious classes, dozens of them to get a bachelor's, right? And in all those religious classes, I didn't come across this idea, including a semester of Greek, right? And so it's very interesting, sort of how deeply this idea that faith is this modern idea of faith, right? Faith is this thing I believe, right? It's very interesting how deep that runs, rather than more the idea of commitment. Now, I was never good enough at Greek to actually analyze this at sort of a first century level. I'm not language scholar enough to decide for myself. But
no, me neither.
But just accepting the proposition, right? Just giving it its best view. If that's right, if how we use faith is very different today from what it was then, it does sort of give us the opportunity to re-examine a lot of the way we do commitment to any worldview, but especially Christianity, since that's where pistis comes from.
Yeah, and I mean, just while we're on the history and whether, I mean, so there's this question about when you're proposing fictionalism, for example, are you proposing a radical change to religion? Are you being revisionary? And it doesn't seem to me a problem. One option is just to say, yeah, sure, I'm doing it in a new way. If other people want to do as well, what's the problem? But I think it's interesting ways in which it's maybe less of a radical change than one might think. So one is, what we've just been discussing about the focus on belief is perhaps a modern corruption. But also something I think we've forgotten is that I'm inclined to think a kind of fictionalism about the personal characteristics of God has always been a part of mainstream Christianity right back to the early church fathers. So we have people like Origen and Gregory of Nyssa, who these people who are part of what we call apophatic or negative theology. People who think that we can't know anything about the nature of God, right? God is literally unknowable. And if we can't know anything about the nature of God, then God can't literally be wise or powerful. If human predicates don't apply to God, then God can't literally be a person. So I'm inclined to think we can interpret these people as embracing a kind of fictionalism, that they think, we talk about God, for example, as a loving parent or as a kind of person for the practice, but they didn't literally believe God was. They thought God was beyond human category. So, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate this. I had a very angry blog post on my TLS paper by the biologist Jerry Coyne saying, "Oh, what? So you're saying people didn't believe in the resurrection?" Or
I read that actually.
So So the reason I wrote this blog post, "Religion but Not as We Know," was to try and clarify. So I certainly think people in history literally believed in the resurrection. But so to that extent, the fictionalist is proposing something new. But my kind of fictionalism about God, where I don't literally think God is personal, but I do think there is a reality there that we talk about as though it were a person. I think that is not so much a radical, that has always been a part of mainstream Christianity, going right back, I think.
Yeah, I sort of agree with part of this, because if we cast ourselves back, a little hard to do because we live in the days of cell phones and Skype and that sort of thing. But if we cast ourselves back to the first century, and we're listening to the Apostle Paul at some point in one of his missionary journeys, right? And the story he's relaying at the moment is that he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, right? So it's not a hard story to imagine, right? We can imagine sitting around listening to a colleague or a public figure relaying a story. It's pretty easy. Surely not everyone had the same sense of commitment that Paul actually saw Jesus versus Paul's just a little nutty right there, right? And so, surely even then, if you think that if you give the story its best philosophical view and just say that it's true and Paul's a real person and he's going around telling his personal story, it's not hard to imagine that and to think surely not everyone was equally committed to Paul's notion that he'd seen Jesus on the road to Damascus.
Yeah, that's a very interesting case. I mean, I'm inclined to think it is a modern obsession for understandable reasons since the scientific revolution to focus on what do you literally believe. And I'm inclined to think historically it was maybe just a bit more messy. So it wasn't that people didn't believe, thought it was maybe just not something that was really necessarily they had a clear worked out view on. So I mean, one liberal Christian who's been a big, I guess the big influences on me, Marcus Borg, who roughly has the kind of view that I've articulated today of Christianity, and also John Dominic Crossan. So one point John Dominic Crossan makes is, in the Roman Empire, there's all this talk of Caesar being born of a god and riding on chariots through the skies and so on. Now, did people literally believe that? Or was it understood to be a sort of fiction, or was it something you said you believed in? I'm trying to think maybe it was just a bit indeterminate. It was people just didn't sort of sit there and think it wasn't a priority in the way it is in the contemporary world to think, what do I literally believe? So I'm trying to think it was a lot messier, and maybe I certainly think Paul, I'm inclined to think reading Paul's letters he does literally believe a lot of it, but it's difficult for me to tease the end between the end of the literal beliefs and the start of the metaphors, and I think that's a lot less clear than people often think.
Right. And even if Paul did even if he was 100% committed to it, because there are all sorts of memories I have that seem potentially improbable to other people, right? But I'm committed to those memories. They are the ones I have. And so even if Paul was completely committed to it, we could easily imagine other people that relay the story without his level of commitment because they find some value in the story, even if they think that particular part to be fictional.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Matthew.
I was enjoying listening to that conversation. I don't think I've got anything of value that I could add to it.
Well, listeners will have to draw their own conclusions about whether it had
I'm sure they've got me. I'm sure they've got me sussed out already. I've been going through some of the responses that dedicated Christians had to your episode, Philip. So I'd just like to pull out one set of questions that one person asked. I'm not going to go through any other questions. So it's just these two questions that I wanted to ask you. So first, do these questions accurately represent your position? And then would you like to address the concern that the questioner has? So I've got a question here from a listener, someone on the forums known to both Andrew myself, who responds to Unbelievable on a regular basis anyway. So the questions are, why does Philip denigrate certainty, and why does he maintain that certainty and humility are in opposition to one another?
I love certainty. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not really sure what part of the episode of Unbelievable that you're on this is addressing. I can't remember what you might have said that prompted these questions.
I think I was talking a lot about our need to be humble about what we can know about transcendent reality. I mean, I love certainty. I just think, sadly, we don't have very much of it. I mean, I think Descartes got it pretty much right that, the only thing I'm really certain of is the existence of my own conscious mind, and maybe it's mathematical, maybe some mathematical and logical truths, and everything else. I think we have to trust certain experiences, hope for the best. And so I think, I just think that sadly the human situation, the human epistemological situation, that is to say, our situation with respect to knowledge, is incredibly frail, and it's not what we'd like it to be. And I think both, the dogmatists of religion and the dogmatists of atheism so often overestimate human certainty, and so to that extent, I think we need to be humble about what we can know. And certainly, I mean, I can't imagine. I'm very interested in the kind of arguments that more conventional Christians put forward for the resurrection and stuff. I find it really, really interesting to think about. I can't imagine finding those arguments so compelling that you believe with 90% certainty or something. I mean, even if there's some kind of case there, and I don't accept the case in any for a second, but even if you could put some kind of case, it's hard to see. So I think people are exaggerating the level of confidence it's rational for humans in what they believe. So I have in my new book, Galileo's Error, actually, I talk a little bit about, in the final chapter, David Hume, a great skeptic from philosophy from the 18th century, but he thought the real value of skepticism is reminding us how precarious human knowledge is and countering dogmatism. And he says, he's talking in his own time in the 18th century, and he says, people are so certain of what they believe and they don't want to hear the arguments of others, and they block it out and it makes them uncomfortable, and they try and make themselves more and more certain so they don't have to be bothered by other people's views. And it kind of reminds me of the times we're living in today a little bit. He thinks you do a bit of philosophy and you realize, I don't even know if there's a table in front of me.
Right.
If I've got hands I might be in the Matrix, and then this naturally counters dogmatism, because you think, God, if even the belief that there's a table in front of me is not certain, my political or religious beliefs are so much less certain. So yeah, I just think the human situation epistemological situation is very frail, and we should have an attitude of humility that reflects that.
Thank you. Yeah, I wish I could be a lot more certain about about everything. Life would be so much simpler if we could be confident of our certainty. And I think, if anything, my exit from firm Christian belief has taught me that we should just embrace the fact that we can't always be certain.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's good. That's good. And I think that's why, in a way, it makes much more sense to think of religious faith as a matter of commitment, because you can say, if you want to be involved in religion, you can say, look, I don't know, but I'm going to commit to this path. Or if you're non-religious, if at some point with your political views or your scientific views or your marriage or whatever, you never know for certain, but you can just say, right, I'm prepared to commit now. And I think I kind of think that's a healthier way to think about these things, in terms of, a commitment rather than belief or certainty.
And that's very nice. I get the sense that we're winding toward a close, and Matthew had in the show notes the opportunity to briefly tease a conversation about panpsychism, and that's been another. So I just finished a book actually about consciousness in which you were quoted about panpsychism. So your views are getting a lot of play.
What book was that?
I will have to link it in the show notes because I'm terrible with titles. It was a brief introduction to consciousness. Is the carry-on title? Yes, that's right. Do you remember the exact title? Because I'm terrible.
I think it's called Conscious.
That's right, conscious, and then there's the bit after the colon that I said a second ago, and so I don't know if we got time to go into thoughts about panpsychism, and it takes us pretty far away from this topic. But if you're willing, at some point in the not too distant future, we'd love to have you over on 4A to talk about panpsychism.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've got this. I've got this book coming out, and I'm actually trying to get to do as many podcasts to come out around the time of publication, which is November 5th in the US and November 7th in the UK. So, yeah, maybe we could work something out on that.
We have some listeners who would be dribbling from the mouth at the thought of that. So if we can...
So that's the Ask an Atheist Anything thing? Or no?
Yes, that'll be Ask an Atheist Anything podcast that we also do. I would love to have that conversation. I would probably be well out of my depth, but would learn quite a lot. So I would love to do that with you if you would be up for it.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, let's...
Excellent. Let's drop that as a teaser then to our listeners. Make sure you subscribe to Ask an Atheist Anything, because at some point before the end of the year we'll have Philip back. That would be brilliant.
Just one thing on that while we're in this context. I'm always keen to emphasize in the context of panpsychism and consciousness that, because people think there are these unfortunate cultural connotations between panpsychism and New Age spirituality, and I just think the attempt to integrate consciousness into our scientific worldview is nothing to do with religion or spirituality. I mean, a lot of the contemporary people defending panpsychism these days are complete atheists, with very scientific motivations, and just see it as consciousness is a phenomenon we know is real, and we have to find a way of fitting it into our scientific worldview somehow. And so it's nothing to do. So although I do independently have some kind of spiritual leanings that we've been talking about today, I do see that as kind of separate from the problem of consciousness and a focus on that. But anyway.
Yeah,
So
thank
I
you
think
for that
that's
clarification. I certainly belonged to a branch of Christianity that would have rejected as too close to New Age anything that you would have just said about panpsychism. So thank you for that clarification.
I understand panpsychism in terms of scientific commitment. I understand it the same way you do. That there's, we're not talking about New Age spiritualism or there's not any appeal to mysticism here. There's an attempt to understand deeply an important part of the human condition, the me of I or whatever, right? Our consciousness, and and that needs not appeal to to some dualism, or we are trying to investigate that in a sensible sort of hard-headed way. We're not very good at it yet because it is a hard problem. But so the nature of that foray conversation would be sort of with those ground rules in mind. There's no accusation of New Age spiritualism or whatever. In fact, one quote from the book, I'll have to do this sort of loosely paraphrased, is that what we know of the physical world, our ideas about laws of physics and chemistry and science, that sort of thing, even if consciousness is something else, or even if the physical world emerges from consciousness, there's no reason to think that the physical world is different than what we perceive it to be, right?
Yeah.
And so my apologies to the author for not being able to work that more clearly, but I finished the book at like 1:30 at night holding the baby. So, November 5 and November 7 in the US and the UK. And what's the title of your upcoming book again?
It is Galileo's Error: Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness. So
really looking forward to it.
Sounds intriguing.
In fact, if we get to do the 4A episode and your publisher would be willing, I'd love to buy an advanced copy just to read it before the show, if such a thing is possible.
Yeah,
sometimes you can do that kind of thing, and sometimes you can't.
We've got these pre-publication copies that are not the final versions, but sort of bound up. So we could, I could send you one of those.
Oh, I'd be happy to buy one, and just because I'd like to be able to understand the thoughts as deeply as possible before them.
Yeah.
So, Matthew, are we wrapping here?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was trying to make a music-based joke there, but my brain failed me.
God, you need to do a rap.
Yeah. So,
but I should probably do some childcare in any case.
Andrew's bundle of consciousness is probably calling for it. I just have one more question for you, Philip, and it's a light-hearted end of show question, and it's absolutely not related to any fruit-based operating systems. I promise you that. Do you watch The Good Place, and do you approve of its treatment of philosophy?
Very good.
Oh, I haven't. No, I should do. I haven't got around to watching that yet. Why? What? It's tell me what it gives a bad rap to philosophy.
I don't think it does, but I mean the basic premise of The Good Place is it opens up with somebody dying, and they meet Ted Danson, who assures them that they've arrived in the good place because they've been a good person. But it becomes apparent throughout the series that this girl who's been assured she's arrived in the good place doesn't think she deserves to be in the good place.
And in fact, she's not.
Well, I didn't want to give a season one.
Don't give it away. Oh God! I was just gonna say I'll watch it. And okay, well I'll tell you what. Maybe I'll watch some of that, and if we do another podcast, then I'll give you my verdict.
Yeah, they're on to season 3, so things move on and change a lot. But these people arrive and they think they're in there's been what's what I'm looking for?
There's a mistake.
Yes, it's been a mistake. Yeah, so they've been replaced with the real deserving person who happened to share their name. So, but there's one of the characters is a philosopher, and the trope around him is he is so tied up in his philosophy he's incapable of making a decision, because he keeps referring to different philosophers over different situations, and the end result is he can't choose anything. And there's one point where a form of torture is he's given two hats, and he has to choose which hat is going to be his hat, and he just can't do it.
But the interesting thing about the show, I think I mentioned not a professional philosopher, right? But as far as I can tell, when they do have, it's very lighthearted, these philosophical conversations, but when they do have them, the writers have made a real attempt to be fair to compatibilism or to utilitarianism. They name philosophers regularly. You've got Kant or Descartes. And so there is a real philosophical underpinning to the show where they're trying to grapple with life's pretty big questions. And one of the real successes of the show is that they're sort of able to do this without ever taking the show too seriously.
Right. Oh, that sounds great. I can't believe I haven't been watching this. I'll have to check it out.
And the episodes are short. They're only about 20 minutes long each episode as well. Very, very short.
All right. Yeah. That's handy if you've got kids. Yeah, on the indecision of philosophers, I guess I'm inclined to think actually there's more consensus in philosophy than there is in economics. And we let them rule the world. So,
that is a great punch. I like that. That is fabulous.
So yeah.
I think that's it from me.
Great.
Any roundup comments from either of you two?
I think no. I've really enjoyed that discussion. I think that's great. I think I'm sorted. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being on. We've sort of talked about a lot of things today, the nature of mathematics and religious fictionalism. Yeah. And while I'm still not quite sure where I stand in regard to religious fictionalism, I certainly understand it better as a result of this conversation, and I thank you.
That's great.
Thank you for taking that.
Well, thank you for letting me have the chance to. I did feel I wanted to clarify more of the content of my actual practice than I did in the Unbelievable podcast. So it was nice to have an opportunity to think about that and talk about that in a little bit more detail.
It's quite short, isn't it? When you're on Unbelievable, we think of the shows as being an hour and a half because that's the time slot they take up, but the amount of conversation that you actually have is a lot shorter than that because there are announcements and commercials, and the person that you're talking to sort of is going to take up at least half the time, and because it's nailed into quite a narrow radio slot, it's sort of easy for listeners to walk away misunderstanding. That's not always the case, and it's not an implicit criticism of Unbelievable. I think it's a great show. And I listen every week, but it is possible just to not get out all the things that you'd like to say.
Yeah.
And so you're welcome back anytime here on Still Unbelievable. And Philip, right before we close, I know that you've got your book coming out on November 5th and in the U.S., November 7th in the U.K. And maybe you'd like to take a second and tell us briefly about the book.
Yeah, so the book's called Galileo's Error, Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness. And it's really about the problem of consciousness, the difficulty of trying to work out how to integrate consciousness into our scientific worldview, how it is exactly brains manage to produce feelings and experiences and pleasure and pain. So I think what's distinct about I think it's generally taken these days as a serious scientific problem, the problem of consciousness. But I think what one very common reaction is to say, okay, there is a problem here, but we just need to do more neuroscience and we'll work it out. And I think the reason people think that is because they look to the great success of physical science in explaining more and more of the universe we live in. And so that, that gives them confidence that we just need to carry on in the same way and we'll one day crack the problem of consciousness. But what I try to argue is that the irony here is that actually the reason science has been so successful is precisely because it was designed to exclude consciousness. And Galileo is pretty explicit about this. So that really Galileo kicks off the scientific revolution by dividing nature into the quantitative mathematical world that we can describe with mathematics, the domain of natural science, and then the qualitative world of consciousness that's outside of the domain of science. So that was the whole setup from the start. And we've kind of forgotten about those philosophical underpinnings, that the whole project was premised on ignoring consciousness. So I think if Galileo were to time travel to the present day and hear about this problem of explaining consciousness in terms of physical science, he'd say, of course you can't do that. I designed physical science to deal with quantities rather than qualities. So I think really if we want a science of consciousness, I think we now really need to rethink what science is and rethink those philosophical underpinnings. So there's a big story there, but that's the kind of that's the start of it.
Matthew, do you want to talk about the ways to get in touch, or do you want to leave that to me?
Yeah. So I just wanted to close up with a couple more comments, and then I'll do that.
Okay.
No,
and Philip's contact details and etc.
Yes. So thank you once again for coming on, Philip. Certainly, you've made me think more positively about fictionalism. I wasn't sure how this afternoon's conversation was going to go, but that's certainly what the result of that has been. So thank you for that, and once again, thank you for being so enthusiastic about coming on for what is not an enormous podcast. So thank you for that, Philip. Really appreciate that.
Thanks.
And we're going
really
to try to, it has been. I've really enjoyed it. And it's wonderful to have a second English accent on this backing me up. It's brilliant. Even if, as we found out right at the beginning, you are a Mac user, but that is absolutely a forgiveness that I'll send your way.
I'm a what?
A Mac user.
Right.
So, and as has been hinted at, we'll try to get you back on for an episode on Ask an Atheist Anything, talk about panpsychism, because we know we have listeners who will absolutely want to talk about that, who'll be really enthusiastic about listening to that. So this is a teaser. If any of our listeners have a question specifically for you that they would like us to put to you on that subject, get it in quickly, because we're going to make preparations. So in order to contact us, it's reasonpress.net or reasonpress@gmail.com to ask us a question, or in the links at the bottom of this episode, click on the link that Anchor will give you in the episode, and you can record us a voice message directly using the Anchor app on any device or PC operating system that you care to use. In order to contact Philip, it's at philipgoffphilosophy.com, or you can contact him on Twitter at Philip_Goff, or there's the blog, which I believe is a WordPress blog, which is consciousandconsciousness.com. I follow that.
Conscience and Consciousness.
Yeah, that's right. I follow the blog. You will learn something in every post. I'll try and remember to include a link to the Religion But Not As We Know It blog post in the show notes. Thank you, Philip. I've really had a great past 2 hours. Thank you once again. This has been a wonderful episode.
No worries. Thank you very much.